Bernard didn't hear the glass fall at first. It was halfway down the marble hallway with a mop bucket that squeaked every few steps, thinking about the rent notice folded in his pocket and whether his daughter had remembered to lock the door after school. Then a sound came from the executive lounge. Not loud, just wrong. When he pushed the door open, the woman on the floor looked like someone who had simply sat down too fast, one heel twisted under her leg, one hand still resting near the edge of the table. Her eyes were open but empty. Bernard stood there for half a second too long. Then the memory of a CPR class from years ago came back, like something pulled from deep water. He dropped the mop and knelt beside her. Morning always arrived quietly in Bernard's apartment. The building was old enough that the pipes made small knocking sounds before the water warmed up, and the heater in the hallway hummed like it was tired of doing the same job every winter. He had gotten used to waking before the alarm. Years of it. Some habits never left once life forced them in. Bernard sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before standing. His knees always felt stiff at first. Not painful exactly, just slow. Across the small hallway, a door stood half open. A soft light glowed inside. His daughter was already awake. He walked toward the doorway and leaned against the frame without speaking. Leela sat cross-legged on the floor, hair still messy from sleep, a school notebook open in front of her. She had colored the margins again. Small flowers this time, purple and blue. She always did that when she was thinking. "Morning," Bernard said. She didn't look up right away. "Morning." Her voice was quiet but steady, the way children sound when they're already thinking about the day ahead. "You eat yet?" he asked. She shook her head. "I was waiting." He stepped into the kitchen. Calling it a kitchen felt generous. 2 counters, 1 narrow stove. The refrigerator hummed louder than it should. Still, it worked. That mattered. Bernard cracked eggs into a pan and stood there watching them cook. The window over the sink faced another brick wall only a few feet away. A thin strip of sky sat above it. Gray today. Rain maybe. Behind him, Leela moved her chair closer to the table. "You got your math test today?" he asked without turning. "Yeah. You feel ready?" A small pause. "I think so." Bernard nodded even though she couldn't see it. "Thinking counts." She smiled a little at that. They ate without rushing. There wasn't much food, but there was enough. Eggs, 2 slices of toast, split between them. The last of the orange juice. Bernard folded the rent notice again after breakfast and slid it back into his wallet. The paper had already softened from being handled too many times. He didn't say anything about it. Lila noticed anyway. She always did. "Dad." He looked up. "You don't have to worry about it right now." Bernard blinked once. "You got mind-reading powers now?" She shrugged. "Just practice." He chuckled under his breath. Kids had a way of seeing things adults tried to hide. He rinsed the plates and dried his hands on a towel that had faded from too many washes. "What time you done today?" he asked. 3:30. "I'll be home after 6. She nodded. Same schedule as always. Bernard grabbed his jacket from the hook near the door. The sleeves were slightly frayed at the cuffs, but the fabric was still thick enough for the cold. Before leaving, he paused beside her chair. "You lock the door when you get back." "I know. And call me if anything feels off." "Dad, I'm serious." She rolled her eyes lightly. "I know." He rested a hand on her shoulder for a moment, just long enough. Then he stepped out into the hallway. Outside, the air carried that damp smell that came before rain. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. Bernard walked slowly at first, letting the cold wake him up the rest of the way. People passed without looking at each other. Everyone had somewhere to go. He reached the stop just as the bus rounded the corner. Lucky. The ride into downtown took about 20 minutes. Bernard sat near the back and watched the city wake up through the scratched windows, store lights turning on, the livery trucks backing into narrow alleys, a man jogging through the park with headphones. Ordinary things. He liked ordinary things. They meant nothing had gone wrong yet. The Ashcroft Tower rose into view before the bus even reached the final stop. 40 stories of glass and steel that caught the morning light like something expensive. Bernard had worked there almost 5 years now. long enough to know the quiet corners, long enough to move through the building without being noticed. Most people didn't pay attention to janitors. That was fine with him. Attention usually meant trouble. He stepped off the bus and crossed the street with the morning crowd. Inside the lobby, everything looked polished enough to reflect your shoes. Marble floors, tall windows, a reception desk that curved like it had been sculpted instead of built. Bernard nodded to Marcus at the security station. Marcus lifted 2 fingers in greeting. Morning. Bernard signed in and grabbed the maintenance cart waiting near the service hallway. The wheels squeaked when he pushed it. They had squeaked for 3 months now. Someone had written a repair request. It still hadn't happened. He didn't mind. The sound kept him company during long hallways. Most mornings followed the same pattern. Offices first, bathrooms second, executive floors last. The higher floors stayed quiet early in the day. Most executives arrived later after meetings somewhere else. Bernard preferred it that way. Less people meant less conversation he didn't need. Around 10:30 he reached the 27th floor. The hallway there always smelled faintly of coffee and new carpet. He moved slowly, replacing trash liners, wiping surfaces, checking small things that no one noticed unless they were wrong. His hands worked automatically. Years of routine made the motions easy. For a while the building felt almost peaceful. Just the soft roll of the cartwheels, the distant hum of elevators, the quiet rhythm of work. Bernard was halfway down the hallway when he heard something from behind a closed door. Not loud, just different. A sharp sound, like glass tapping marble. He stopped walking. The hallway returned to silence. Bernard waited a moment, listening. Nothing. Probably nothing, he thought. Buildings made sounds. Pipes. Doors. Air vents shifting. Still, something about it stayed in his chest. He turned his head toward the executive lounge. The door was slightly open. Just a few inches. That door usually stayed shut. Bernard pushed his cart closer and rested one hand on the handle. For a second, he almost kept walking. Not his business. That was usually the safest rule in buildings like this. But the silence behind that door didn't feel normal. He pushed it open, slowly. The room inside looked bright from the morning sun. Glass walls on 2 sides. A long polished table in the center. A single high heel lay near one chair. Bernard's eyes moved across the floor, then stopped. A woman was lying beside the table. Still. Too still. Her dark hair spread slightly across the marble floor, one arm bent awkwardly under her side. Bernard stood frozen in the doorway. His brain took a second to understand what he was seeing. Then something cold slid down his spine. He moved forward quickly. The woman's face looked pale. Her eyes were open but unfocused. Bernard knelt beside her. "Ma'am?" No response. He touched her shoulder. Nothing. The room felt suddenly too quiet. Bernard's heart started beating faster. He leaned closer. Her chest wasn't moving. Not that he could see. A memory stirred somewhere in the back of his mind. A training room from years ago. Plastic mannequins. An instructor saying the same steps again and again. Check breathing. Call for help. Start compressions. Bernard looked around the empty room. No one else. Just the 2 of them. He placed 2 fingers carefully against the side of her neck. For a moment, he felt nothing. His stomach tightened. Then maybe, something. Or maybe it was his own pulse. He couldn't be sure. Bernard inhaled slowly. The instructor's voice returned in fragments. Push hard, push fast, don't stop. He placed his hands over the center of her chest. For half a second he hesitated, not because he didn't know what to do, because he knew that once he started, there was no stepping back. Then he began the compressions. 1, 2, 3. The quiet executive lounge filled with the dull rhythm of his hands pressing down against the floor beneath her. Bernard counted under his breath, trying to keep the pace steady. 30 compressions. Then he tilted her head back slightly. Breath in, breath out. He went back to compressions. The seconds stretched. His arms started to burn. Still nothing. "Come on," he muttered softly. Another round. Another. Bernard didn't know how long he had been kneeling there. Time felt strange, like it had slowed down but also rushed forward at the same time. He kept going, because stopping wasn't an option. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance. Somewhere down the hallway, footsteps suddenly echoed. Voices. Getting closer. Bernard barely noticed. He was still pressing down, still counting, still hoping the next breath would be the one that brought her back. The footsteps reached the doorway fast. Too fast. Bernard heard the first voice before he looked up. What the? Then another voice sharper. Call security. Bernard didn't stop. 30 compressions. He pushed down again, harder this time. The woman's head shifted slightly with the motion. Someone rushed across the room, shoes striking marble. Get away from her. Bernard shook his head without looking up. She's not breathing, he said, breath tight. I'm doing CPR. But the words didn't slow anyone down. A hand grabbed his shoulder. Hard. Move. Bernard kept his palms locked where they were. If I stop, move away from her. The grip tightened and tried to pull him back. Bernard resisted without meaning to. Wait, he said. Just give me Another voice cut in. That's Miss Ashcroft. The name passed through the room like electricity. For the first time, Bernard looked up. 3 people stood around him. 2 assistants. He recognized them vaguely from the floor. And a tall man in a dark suit whose face had gone completely white. The assistant closest to Bernard pointed at him. What did you do? The words landed like a slap. Bernard blinked. Nothing. She collapsed. I found her like this. The man in the suit dropped to his knees beside Alexandra Ashcroft. Alexandra? His voice shook. He leaned close to her face, searching for breath. Bernard moved back slightly to give space, but his hands hovered over her chest, instinct still telling him to continue. She needs compressions, Bernard said quickly. Her pulse, I couldn't. Don't touch her, the assistant snapped. Bernard froze. Not because he wanted to, because suddenly there were too many voices, too many eyes. The room had filled. Someone else had arrived at the door, then another. Phones already out. Recording. The man in the suit pressed 2 fingers against Alexandra's neck. His brow tightened. Where's medical? He barked. On the way, someone answered from the hall. Bernard sat back on his heels. His chest rose and fell quickly now. The adrenaline was starting to leave his arms, leaving behind a deep ache. He watched Alexandra's face. Still pale. Still too. Still. A few seconds passed. Then suddenly, a small, rough inhale. The sound barely carried across the room, but everyone heard it. Alexandra's chest lifted slightly, then fell. The man beside her exhaled sharply. Thank God. Another breath came, weak, uneven. But there. Bernard closed his eyes for a moment. Just one. Relief washed through him so suddenly his hands trembled. He hadn't realized how tightly he had been holding his own breath. Paramedics burst through the door seconds later with equipment and urgency that filled the entire room. Clear space. People shuffled backward. Bernard moved with them automatically. 2 medics dropped beside Alexandra. One checking her pulse, the other fitting an oxygen mask. She's got a rhythm, one said. BP is low but present. The room seemed to exhale all at once. But that relief didn't reach Bernard the same way, because as he stood near the wall, he noticed the way people were looking at him. Not grateful, not relieved, suspicious. Whispers had already started. That's the janitor. He was on top of her. I walked in, and he was pressing on her chest. Phones were still raised. Bernard's stomach tightened slowly. He wiped his hands on his pants without realizing it. Marcus from security appeared in the doorway. He scanned the room quickly. What happened? Voices answered all at once. I found him here. He was touching her. Alexandra was on the floor. Marcus held up a hand. Stop. His eyes moved through the room, then landed on Bernard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus stepped closer. You okay? Bernard nodded once. I was doing CPR. Marcus looked at Alexandra, now being stabilized by the medics. Then back at Bernard. You alone when you found her? Yes. Anyone else here? No. Marcus exhaled slowly. But before he could say anything more, the tall man in the suit stood up abruptly. His expression had hardened. You, he said, pointing directly at Bernard. Bernard straightened slightly. Yes? What were you doing in here? I heard something fall, and you decided to come inside. Bernard frowned slightly. The door was open. That doesn't answer the question. Bernard felt the attention of the room shift again, like the temperature had changed. She was on the floor, he said carefully, not breathing. And you thought it was your place to touch her? The question landed wrong. Bernard blinked. I thought it was my place to help. The man stared at him for a long second. Something about the silence that followed made Bernard uneasy. Then one of the assistants spoke again. He was leaning over her when we walked in. Another voice added quickly, pressing down on her chest. The man in the suit's jaw tightened. Bernard felt the ground shifting beneath the moment. Slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. That's CPR, Bernard said. The assistant shook her head sharply. We don't know that. Bernard stared at her. His chest felt suddenly tight again. You think I was hurting her? No one answered immediately, but their silence spoke loud enough. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Let's slow down, he said. We'll review security. We don't need security footage to see what was happening, the man interrupted. Bernard felt heat rising behind his ears. I was trying to save her life. The words came out quieter than he expected, but they carried across the whole room. The man's eyes hardened further. We're taking advantage of the situation. The accusation hung in the air, heavy, unbelievable. Bernard stared at him. For a moment he genuinely couldn't process what he had just heard. Sir, Marcus began carefully, but the man had already turned to the security team behind him. Escort him out. Bernard felt something inside his chest drop. What? You'll leave the building immediately. Bernard shook his head slowly. I didn't do anything wrong. That's not your decision? Marcus stepped forward. His voice was quieter now. Bernard, maybe we step outside and sort this out. Bernard looked around the room. No one met his eyes. Even the assistants had stepped back, as if distance made them safer. Behind him, the paramedics were lifting Alexandra onto a stretcher, her face still pale, but breathing, alive, because he had knelt beside her, because he hadn't walked away. Bernard watched them wheel her past. For a moment, he wondered if she would wake up, if she would say something, anything. But her eyes stayed closed. The stretcher rolled out into the hallway. The room slowly emptied after it, leaving Bernard standing beside his cart. Marcus placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. Come on. Bernard looked down at his hands. They still trembled slightly. He followed Marcus into the hallway. The squeak of the cart wheels echoed faintly behind them. No one pushed it now. People had gathered in small groups further down the corridor, whispering, looking. Bernard kept his eyes forward, step after step. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. No one spoke. When the doors opened in the lobby, Marcus guided him toward the security desk. Just sit for a minute, Marcus said. Bernard remained standing. I saved her. Marcus didn't answer right away. I know what you were trying to do. That's not what they think. Marcus sighed quietly. Things get complicated when powerful people get scared. Bernard looked toward the glass entrance doors. Outside, rain had finally started falling, thin lines streaking down the windows. What happens now? Bernard asked. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. Right now? He hesitated. Right now you're suspended from work until they review everything. Bernard felt the words settle slowly, like stones dropping into deep water. Suspended. For trying to help. He let out a breath, not angry, just tired. Marcus slid a form across the desk. Company policy. Bernard didn't read it. He just signed where Marcus pointed. The pen scratched softly across the paper. A small sound, but it seemed louder than it should have. When he finished, Marcus looked at him with something like regret. You should go home. Bernard nodded once. Then he turned toward the door. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. He stepped into it without opening his jacket. Cold water soaked into the fabric almost immediately. But he kept walking, because standing still felt worse. The rain stayed with him most of the way home. Not heavy enough to stop people from walking. Just steady, quiet. The kind that slowly works through fabric until everything feels damp. Bernard didn't rush. The bus ride back felt longer than the morning ride, even though the route was the same. He sat near the window again, hands resting on his knees, watching the gray city slide past. People stepped on and off. Conversations came and went around him. No one noticed him. That was normal. He kept seeing the same moment in his mind. Alexander Ashcroft on the floor. The sound of that first breath. And then, the way the room had turned against him almost immediately after. It didn't make sense. He rubbed his hands together slowly. They still felt strange. Not sore exactly. Just empty, now that the urgency was gone. The bus hissed to a stop near his neighborhood. Bernard stepped off and walked the remaining blocks in silence. By the time he reached the apartment building, the rain had begun to thin out. Water dripped from the edges of the fire escapes. Somewhere a radio played faint music through an open window. Normal sounds. But everything felt slightly tilted. He climbed stairs instead of using the elevator. The old machine often stalled between floors anyway. Second floor. Third. When he reached the hallway outside his apartment, the door was already unlocked. Lila was home. Bernard paused for a second before stepping inside. The smell of reheated soup filled the room. Lila sat at the table with her homework spread out again. She looked up immediately. You're early. Bernard hung his jacket by the door. Yeah. She studied his face for a moment. You sick? He shook his head. No. Then he sat across from her. The chair creaked slightly under his weight. Lila waited. She had learned patience in small ways over the years. Bernard finally spoke. I might be home a little more for a while. Her eyebrows drew together. Like, vacation? No. A small pause stretched between them. What happened? Bernard rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table. There were small scratches in the wood from years of use. He focused on those while choosing the words. Someone got hurt at work today. Lila sat up straighter. Are they okay? I think so. You helped? Another pause. Yes? Then why are you home? Bernard looked up at her, because explaining it out loud made it feel even stranger. They want to look into it first. Into what? Everything. Lila leaned back slightly. Her face had that careful look she got when something didn't make sense. Did you do something wrong? Bernard felt that question land deeper than the accusations earlier. He answered immediately. No. She nodded once. That was enough for her. Children often believed the people they trusted without needing evidence. Adults made it harder. She pushed her math notebook aside. Then it'll be okay. Bernard didn't answer right away. He wished certainty worked the way she thought it did. Instead he asked, You eat already? Just soup. Good. He stood and moved to the stove, heating the rest of the pot without really thinking about it. The apartment felt small in the quiet. Outside, the rain slowed to occasional drops against the window. After a while, Lila returned to her homework. Bernard sat at the table with the bowl in front of him. He stared into it longer than he ate. The next morning arrived slower, not because the sun waited, because Bernard had nowhere to go. He still woke before the alarm. Old habits. For a few minutes he lay there staring at the ceiling. The room looked the same as always, but the rhythm of the day had changed. He sat up eventually. The kitchen clock ticked loudly while he made coffee. Lila entered a few minutes later, tying her hair back. You still home today? Yeah. Tomorrow too? Probably. She seemed to consider that. Okay. They ate breakfast the same way they always did. But there was an extra quiet between sentences. Not uncomfortable, just uncertain. After she left for school, Bernard cleaned the apartment slowly. Not because it needed it, because movement helped him think. Around mid-morning, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered after the second ring. Hello? A professional voice responded. Is this Bernard Walker? Yes. This is Human Resources from Ashcroft Industries. Bernard leaned slightly against the counter. Yes. We're conducting a formal review regarding the incident yesterday morning. Incident. The word felt strange. Yes, Bernard said. You are required to attend a meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Okay. There will be several members of the executive team present. Bernard's stomach tightened slightly. Do I need to bring anything? No, we simply need your statement. The woman paused briefly. Until the review is complete, you remain suspended from your duties. I understand. We'll see you tomorrow. The line clicked off. Bernard lowered the phone slowly. The apartment returned to silence. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then he poured the rest of the coffee down the sink. It had gone cold anyway. The Ashcroft Tower looked the same the next morning, tall, untouched, as if nothing unusual had ever happened inside it. Bernard arrived 10 minutes early. Habit again. Marcus spotted him from the security desk. He walked over quietly. You all right? Bernard nodded. Yeah. Marcus glanced around the lobby. They've been talking about it upstairs. Bernard didn't ask what it meant. He could guess. Marcus lowered his voice. Some people say you were trying to help. And others? Marcus hesitated. You know how stories move in places like this. Bernard did. Facts had a way of bending when power entered the room. Marcus handed him a temporary visitor badge. They'll call you up soon. Bernard clipped it to his jacket. For a few minutes he sat in the lobby chair near the window. Executives passed through in pressed suits. Assistants moved quickly with tablets and folders. No one spoke to him. Most didn't recognize him. Then the elevator doors opened. A woman in a gray blazer stepped out. Mr. Walker? Bernard stood. Yes, please come with me. They rode the elevator to the 36th floor, higher than Bernard had ever been inside the building. The carpet was thicker here, the air quieter. She led him down a short hallway into a conference room. Several people already sat around the table. Bernard recognized the tall man from the previous day immediately, the one who had pointed at him. His expression looked colder now. The woman gestured toward an empty chair. Please sit. Bernard did. A folder lay in front of each person at the table. Except him. The woman at the head of the table folded her hands. Mr. Walker, she began calmly, we're reviewing the circumstances surrounding the collapse of Ms. Alexandra Ashcroft. Bernard nodded once. We need a clear understanding of your actions. I understand. She opened the folder. Start from when you entered the executive lounge. Bernard inhaled slowly. Then he began describing the morning. The sound he heard, the open door, finding Alexandra on the floor, checking her breathing. Beginning CPR. He spoke steadily. No extra details. Just what happened. When he finished, silence filled the room for several seconds. Then the tall man leaned forward. You expect us to believe you simply walked in and decided to perform CPR on the CEO of this company? Bernard looked directly at him. She wasn't breathing. That's not what I asked. Bernard didn't raise his voice. You asked what happened. That's what happened. The man's eyes narrowed. You had no authorization to be in that room. The door was open. That's irrelevant. Bernard felt the tension in the room tightening. The woman at the head of the table spoke again. Mr. Walker, several employees entered the room and observed you pressing down on Ms. Ashcroft's chest. Yes? You understand how that might appear to them? Bernard held her gaze. It appears like CPR. No one responded to that right away. The room held still. Bernard noticed small things when silence lasted too long. The way one executive kept tapping a pen against the table, the quiet hum of the building's ventilation, the faint reflection of the skyline in the glass wall behind them. The woman at the head of the table closed the folder slowly. Mr. Walker, she said, choosing each word carefully, the concern isn't only what you say you were doing. Bernard waited. The concern is the uncertainty surrounding the moment before others entered the room. Bernard frowned slightly. I told you. She was already on the floor. Yes, the woman said. That is your statement. The tall man leaned back in his chair. But no one saw that part. Bernard felt something tighten behind his ribs. You think I knocked her down? We're saying, the man replied evenly, that we can't rule out what happened before witnesses arrived. Bernard looked around the table. 7 people, all dressed in expensive suits, all studying him like he was a puzzle they hadn't solved yet. He rested his hands on the table. They're alive because I didn't walk past that door. No one spoke. Then the man across from him flipped open his folder. There were marks on Ms. Ashcroft's sternum. Bernard blinked once. That happens during CPR. Yes, the man said. It also happens during physical struggle. Bernard felt heat move slowly up his neck. I wasn't struggling with her. The woman at the head of the table raised a hand slightly. We're not making final conclusions today. But the tone in the room suggested otherwise. Bernard exhaled slowly through his nose. You have security cameras in every hallway. The executives exchanged small glances. Then look at them. The tall man's jaw shifted slightly. We will. Bernard leaned back in his chair. Then there's nothing else to say. For a moment the room went quiet again. Finally the woman closed the folder completely. The investigation will continue while we review all available information. Bernard nodded once. What does that mean for my job? Another pause. Then she answered. For now, your suspension remains in place. Bernard had expected that. Still, hearing it said out loud felt different. Understood. He stood. No one told him to sit back down. The meeting was clearly finished. As he walked toward the door, the tall man spoke again. One more thing, Mr. Walker. Bernard turned. If the footage contradicts your statement, the consequences will be severe. Bernard held his gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly, Then I hope you watch it carefully. And he left the room. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up. Bernard watched the floor numbers change slowly. 32, 29, 24. The building hummed around him like nothing unusual had happened. By the time he reached the lobby, Marcus was already looking toward the elevator. How'd it go? He asked. Bernard clipped off the visitor badge and set it on the desk. They're still deciding what they think happened. Marcus sighed. Yeah, I figured. Bernard nodded toward the security monitors. You seen the footage yet? Marcus shook his head. Only upper security can access executive floor recordings. Bernard absorbed that quietly. Marcus lowered his voice. Look, I know what you did. Bernard looked at him. I'm not the one who needs convincing. Marcus didn't disagree. Bernard stepped outside. The rain had stopped overnight. Puddles reflected the tall glass tower behind him. For a moment, he stood there looking up at it. 40 floors. Thousands of employees. One moment inside it had somehow shifted his entire life. He turned and started walking. 3 days passed. They moved slowly, the kind of slow that makes hours stretch. Bernard applied for temporary work at 2 places nearby, a grocery warehouse, a cleaning service. Neither called back yet. Money had already started to worry him more than the accusation. Rent waited for no explanation. One evening, Lila sat across from him at the kitchen table again. You hear from work? Not yet. She traced a finger along the edge of her notebook. They'll figure it out. Bernard hoped she was right, but the world didn't always correct itself quickly. Sometimes it never corrected itself at all. The next morning his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Bernard answered. Hello? A different voice this time. Male. Formal. Mr. Walker, this is Ashcroft Industries Corporate Communications. Bernard felt a small shift in his stomach. Yes. There has been public interest in the incident involving Ms. Limis, Ashcroft. Bernard didn't like the way that sounded. What kind of interest? The man hesitated slightly. Someone in the building recorded video. Bernard went still. Video of what? Of you performing CPR. Relief flickered briefly. Then that should clear things up. There was a longer pause this time. Unfortunately, the clip circulating online begins after others entered the room. Bernard felt that flicker disappear. What does it show? You leaning over Ms. Ashcroft, while several employees appear alarmed. Bernard closed his eyes for a moment. Of course, the video has already gained significant attention. How significant? Several million views. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. And what are people saying? Another careful pause. There are multiple interpretations. Bernard almost laughed. He already knew what that meant. What does the company say? We have released a statement acknowledging the ongoing investigation. That's it? For now. Bernard rubbed his forehead slowly. Is there footage from before they walked in? Yes. Then release that. That decision is being evaluated by leadership. Bernard lowered his hand. So the part that shows me trying to save her life stays private. The man didn't answer directly. We'll update you when there are developments. The call ended. Bernard remained standing in the kitchen, the phone still in his hand. A few minutes later, Lila walked in from the hallway. You okay? Bernard forced a small nod. Yeah. But she was already looking at the screen of the old laptop on the table. A video was playing. Someone had sent it to her. The image was shaky. Shot from across the lounge. Bernard recognized the moment immediately. Him kneeling beside Alexandra, voices shouting, hands grabbing his shoulder. The clip ended before the first breath returned to her. The comments below the video scrolled endlessly. Accusations, assumptions, strangers deciding what kind of man he was. Leela looked up slowly. They think you hurt her. Bernard nodded once. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Leela said something quietly. They didn't see the beginning. Bernard sat down across from her. No. Outside the window, the afternoon light had started to fade. He watched the reflection of the screen flicker across the glass. A single moment, cut in half, turned into something else entirely. The first time Bernard heard someone say his name on the street, he thought it was a mistake. He had stepped out of the grocery store with a small bag in his hand. Bread, milk, the cheapest things he could find. A car slowed near the curb. Not enough to stop. Just enough for someone inside to lean toward the open window. That's him. The voice wasn't loud, but Bernard heard it clearly. He kept walking. The car rolled forward again. For the rest of the block, he felt the weight of eyes that weren't actually there. That was how the days started to feel, like the world had tilted slightly toward him. Not curiosity. Judgment. At home, the laptop stayed closed most of the time. Lila had stopped checking the video after the second day, but the internet didn't need her to keep it alive. People had already done that. Clips had spread across platforms Bernard didn't even recognize. Comment sections filled with strangers explaining what they believed had happened in a room they had never seen. Most of them sounded certain. Certainty came easily when someone else carried the consequences. Bernard sat at the kitchen table one afternoon filling out another job application. The paper form asked the same questions every place asked. Name, address, previous employment, reason for leaving. That last line sat in front of him longer than the others. Bernard tapped the pen against the table once, then wrote carefully, suspended during investigation. He didn't add anything else. The phone rang before he finished the form. Another unknown number. He answered slowly. Hello. A woman's voice responded. This is Green Line Warehouse regarding your application. Bernard straightened slightly. Yes. We reviewed your information. A pause. We're unable to move forward at this time. Bernard didn't ask why. He already knew. Still, the woman added quietly, We wish you the best. The line clicked. Bernard placed the phone down carefully. Across the room, the refrigerator hummed. He stared at the application for a moment longer, then folded it in half. Not angry, just tired. That evening, Lila sat beside him on the couch, a textbook open on her lap. She had read the same page 3 times. Bernard noticed. You stuck? She shrugged. A little. What part? She pointed at the paragraph. Bernard leaned forward and read it slowly. History. Something about labor strikes 100 years ago. Workers refusing to leave factories, demanding safer conditions, better pay. Bernard sat back. They were brave, Lila said quietly. He thought about that word for a moment. Sometimes brave just means someone didn't step away. Lila looked at him. You didn't. Bernard didn't answer. He reached over and gently closed the textbook. Take a break. She leaned against his shoulder for a moment. The room stayed quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. Then she asked something carefully. Are they going to fire you? Bernard inhaled slowly. I don't know yet. Would that be bad? Another small pause. Yes, she nodded. Children understood more than adults liked to admit. They sat like that for a while. Eventually, Lila returned to her homework. Bernard watched the window grow darker. The city lights flickered on across the street. He tried not to think about the rent notice still folded inside his wallet. 3 days later, the company called again. This time, it wasn't human resources. Marcus. Bernard recognized the number immediately. Hey. Marcus sounded tired. You seen the news today? No. Bernard had stopped looking. Marcus exhaled. They're running another segment about the video. Bernard leaned back in the chair. What kind of segment? The kind where people argue about it on television. Bernard closed his eyes for a second. Good. Marcus hesitated. They showed your face this time. Bernard opened his eyes again. Of course they did. Look, I shouldn't be telling you this. Bernard waited. Marcus lowered his voice. Upper security finally reviewed the full hallway footage yesterday. Bernard sat up straighter. And? It shows you walking in alone. Bernard felt a small shift in his chest. What about inside the lounge? Camera angle doesn't show the floor clearly. The shift faded slightly. But it shows when everyone else enters. And? Marcus spoke slowly. It shows you already doing compressions. Bernard exhaled quietly. Then that should settle it. Marcus didn't respond right away. That footage hasn't been released. Bernard's fingers tightened around the phone. Why? Executive decision. The words landed like a dull weight. Bernard rubbed his forehead. So the video that makes me look guilty spreads everywhere. Marcus didn't interrupt. And the one that shows what actually happened stays in a private folder. Marcus sighed. Things move slower when reputation is involved. Bernard looked across the apartment. Lila's school backpack rested by the door, a small patch sewn near the zipper where the fabric had torn last year. He spoke quietly. I didn't ask to be involved in any of this. I know. Marcus paused. But there's something else. Bernard waited. Ms. Ashcroft woke up yesterday. Bernard blinked. She's conscious? Yes. A small silence stretched between them. Bernard asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the morning in the lounge. Does she remember anything? Marcus hesitated. Doctors say her memory of the collapse is incomplete. Bernard felt the air shift again. Incomplete how? She remembers feeling dizzy. And she remembers waking up in the hospital. Bernard looked down at his hands, the same hands that had pressed against her chest again and again. Nothing in between? No. The kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall. Marcus finally added, but she's asking questions. Bernard leaned back slowly. What kind of questions? About who found her? The room fell quiet. For the first time in days, Bernard felt something move inside the uncertainty. Not relief. Not yet. Just the faintest sense that the story wasn't finished. The next few days carried a strange kind of waiting. Not the kind where you expect something at a certain time. More like the kind where every phone vibration makes your chest tighten for half a second. Bernard kept the phone on the table where he could see it. It didn't ring much. Mostly spam calls. Sometimes silence for an entire day. He filled the hours with small tasks. Laundry. Fixing the loose hinge on the cabinet door. Walking to the store even when they didn't need anything yet. Movement made time feel less heavy. but the world outside the apartment still carried his name. One afternoon, while waiting in line at the pharmacy, Bernard noticed two people whispering near the magazine rack. They weren't even trying to hide it. One of them held up a phone. The screen reflected the same frozen image he had seen online, him kneeling beside Alexandra Ashcroft. The moment before the room turned against him. Bernard looked away. The cashier finished ringing up his purchase without meeting his eyes. "Have a good day," she said quietly. Her voice sounded careful, like she wasn't sure what kind of man stood in front of her. Bernard nodded and left. Outside, the air felt warmer than it had all week. Spring was trying to arrive. But the weight in his chest hadn't changed. That evening Lila sat at the kitchen table again, her homework spread out in the same neat arrangement she always used. Pencil on the right, notebook centered, eraser near the corner. Bernard watched her for a moment before sitting down. "You got a science project coming up?" he asked. She nodded. "Next month." "What's it about?" "Community health." Bernard smiled faintly. "That sounds serious." She shrugged. "It's mostly about how people help each other." Bernard leaned back in the chair. "That's a good subject." Lila looked at him for a second longer than usual. Then she said something quietly. "My teacher asked if anyone knew someone who had saved a life." Bernard's smile faded slightly. "What did you say?" "I didn't say anything." "Why not?" She lowered her eyes to the notebook. "Because people would look it up." The answer sat between them, heavy in a way children shouldn't have to carry. Bernard reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know." But the world had a way of making innocence feel complicated. Later that night, Bernard couldn't sleep. The apartment stayed quiet except for the faint traffic outside. He sat at the kitchen table again, staring at nothing in particular. His thoughts returned to the same question Marcus had mentioned. She's asking questions. He tried to imagine Alexandra Ashcroft waking up in that hospital room. Bright lights, doctors speaking quietly, someone explaining what had happened, or what they believed had happened. Did anyone tell her about the janitor on the floor beside her? Did they mention his name? Or did the story stop before that part? Bernard rubbed his temples slowly. There were too many possibilities, and none of them were in his control. 2 mornings later, the phone rang again. This time, the number looked familiar. Marcus. Bernard answered immediately. "Hey." Marcus didn't start with small talk. "She's asking to see the footage?" Bernard straightened in the chair. "Which footage?" "The security recordings." Bernard felt something shift inside him. "And?" They showed her the hallway clip. "What did she say?" Marcus hesitated. "She asked why the rest wasn't included." Bernard leaned back slowly. She noticed. "Yeah." The silence on the line carried a different tone this time. Less resignation. More movement. Marcus continued. "She asked specifically about you." Bernard swallowed once. "What did they tell her?" "That you're under investigation." Bernard closed his eyes briefly. "And how did she react?" Marcus gave a small breath of disbelief. "She said something that made the whole room uncomfortable." Bernard waited. Marcus spoke carefully. She said, "If the man performing CPR hadn't acted quickly, she wouldn't be alive." Bernard didn't speak for a moment. The words settled slowly, like something fragile being placed on a table. Marcus continued. "She asked for the full footage. Did they give it to her?" "Not yet." "Why?" Marcus gave a dry laugh. "Because powerful people don't like being forced to admit they might be wrong." Bernard stared at the kitchen wall. The paint near the corner had started to peel slightly. He had meant to fix that months ago. "So what happens now?" Bernard asked. Marcus answered quietly. "I think the story just changed direction." That same afternoon, something else happened. Bernard was walking back from the store again. A man standing outside a small cafe recognized him. Not the same kind of recognition as before. No whispers. No accusations. The man simply said, "You're the one from the video, right?" Bernard paused. "Yes." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I used to be a paramedic." Bernard didn't say anything. The man continued. Your hand placement was right. Bernard felt a small shift in his chest. The man gestured slightly. 30 compressions. Proper depth. Bernard exhaled quietly. I remembered an old class. The man gave a faint smile. Most people panic. Bernard nodded. I almost did. They stood there for another moment. Then the man said something simple. You probably saved her. Bernard looked down at the pavement briefly, then back up. I hope so. The man nodded once and went back inside the cafe. Bernard continued walking home. The conversation stayed with him the whole way, not because it solved anything, but because it was the first time someone had spoken to him like the moment in that room actually mattered, not like a rumor, not like a headline, just like something human. That night, the phone buzzed again, another unknown number. Bernard answered carefully. Hello? A calm voice spoke on the other end. Mr. Walker. Bernard recognized the tone immediately. Corporate, yes. This is the office of Alexandra Ashcroft. Bernard felt the room grow still. We would like to request a meeting with you. The words hung in the air. Regarding what? Bernard asked quietly. A short pause followed. Then the voice answered. Regarding the morning you saved her life. Bernard didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't hear the words, because he needed a second to let them settle. Saved her life. For days he had listened to people describe the same moment in a dozen different ways. Suspicion. Investigation. Incidention. This was the first time anyone from that building had used those words. Mr. Walker? The voice on the phone said gently. I'm here, Bernard replied. We'd like to arrange a meeting tomorrow afternoon. Where? At Ashcroft Tower. Bernard looked around his small kitchen. The chipped counter. The quiet clock on the wall. The same apartment he had walked into the day everything started to unravel. I'll be there, he said. 3 o'clock. The call ended. Bernard set the phone down slowly. For a while he remained standing there, not thinking about what he would say, just thinking about the sound of those words again. Saved her life. The next morning moved differently, not faster, but sharper. Bernard noticed more things on the walk to the bus stop. The smell of coffee drifting from the bakery on the corner, the way sunlight reflected off the wet pavement from last night's rain. A man walking his dog who nodded politely as they passed. Small details. They felt heavier today. The bus ride downtown was quiet. Bernard took the same seat near the back. He watched the city move by again, but this time the building seemed to hold his attention longer. Ashcroft Tower came into view like it always did. Tall, still, unchanged. But Bernard knew the inside of it now held a different conversation. Marcus spotted him the moment he walked into the lobby. You heard from them? Bernard nodded. Yeah. Marcus leaned against the desk. About time. Bernard studied his face. You knew? Marcus shrugged slightly. Word moves. Bernard didn't ask anything else. Marcus handed him another visitor badge. 36th floor again. Bernard clipped it onto his jacket. Before stepping toward the elevator, he asked quietly, How's she doing? Marcus gave a small nod. Walking. Bernard felt something ease inside his chest. Good. The elevator ride felt shorter this time. Maybe because Bernard knew what waited upstairs. Or maybe because the uncertainty had started to thin. The doors opened onto the same thick carpet, the same quiet hallway. But instead of the conference room, the assistant from before guided him further down the corridor. To Ms. Ashcroft's office. Bernard followed. The office door stood open. Sunlight filled the room from tall windows overlooking the city. For a moment he saw only the skyline. Then he noticed the woman standing near the desk. Alexandra Ashcroft looked different than the person he remembered from the floor. Alive in a way that made the memory of that pale stillness feel distant. Her posture was straight but careful, like someone still getting used to standing again. When she turned toward him, their eyes met for the first time. Bernard felt the room grow very quiet. Mr. Walker, she said. Her voice was steady, not loud, just direct. Bernard nodded once. Ma'am. She studied him for a moment longer than most people did. Not suspiciously. More like someone trying to recognize a face from a dream. "You're the man who found me." "Yes." Another small silence followed. Then she said something simple. "Thank you." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Bernard shifted slightly. "I did what anyone would do." Alexandra shook her head once. "No." Her eyes didn't leave his. "Most people would have called for help." Bernard thought about that. Maybe she was right. He hadn't stopped to consider it that morning. There hadn't been time. She gestured toward a chair near the desk. "Please sit." Bernard did. Alexandra remained standing for a moment before lowering herself slowly into the chair behind the desk. She moved carefully, like someone still aware of their body in a new way. "I've spent the last few days asking questions," she said. Bernard listened. "I watched the security footage this morning." He nodded. "Good." Alexandra folded her hands on the desk. "You entered the lounge alone?" "Yes." "You checked my pulse?" "Yes." "And you began CPR within seconds?" Bernard didn't answer. There was nothing to add. She looked down briefly at the folder on her desk, then back at him. "They told me you were under investigation." Bernard kept his voice calm. "That's what I heard." Alexandra's expression changed slightly. Something firmer appeared behind it. "I've already instructed them to end that." Bernard absorbed the words slowly. The room stayed quiet. Then she continued, "The hallway footage shows you running into the room." Bernard nodded. "And the internal camera confirms the timing of the compressions." Another nod. Alexandra leaned back slightly. 30 compressions per cycle. Bernard blinked once. "You counted." She gave a faint smile. "The doctors did." For the first time, the tension in Bernard's shoulders eased a little. Alexandra rested her hands in the desk again. "When I collapsed, my heart had stopped." Bernard felt that sentence settle heavily. "The doctors told me that without immediate CPR," she continued quietly, "they likely would not have been able to restart it." The sunlight through the windows shifted slightly across the floor. Bernard looked down for a moment, then back up. "I'm glad you're okay." Alexandra studied his face again. "You've been through something you didn't deserve." Bernard didn't respond immediately. What could he say to that? Finally, he answered honestly. "It's been a strange week." She nodded slowly. "Yes, it has." The room stayed silent again for a few seconds. Then Alexandra said something more softly. "I watched the video that went public." Bernard felt his stomach tighten slightly, and her expression hardened slightly. "It's incomplete." Bernard let out a quiet breath. That's one word for it. Alexandra opened the folder in front of her. Inside were printed pages, screenshots from security footage, statements, reports. "I've spent my career trying to build a company that treats people fairly," she said. Bernard listened carefully. "And yet," she continued, tapping one page lightly, "the moment something frightening happened, the system inside this building turned against the person who helped me." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried something sharper now. Bernard watched her closely. Alexandra closed the folder. "That's my responsibility." Bernard shook his head slightly. "You weren't conscious." "That doesn't change it." The firmness in her voice left little room for argument. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexandra leaned forward slightly. "There's something I intend to do about it." Bernard felt the direction of the conversation shifting again. He didn't know where it was heading, but the weight of the past week felt like it had finally reached a turning point. And this time, he was hearing the beginning of the truth spoken out loud. Alexander remained quiet for a moment after saying that. Not the kind of pause meant for effect. The kind people take when they're arranging thoughts that carry weight. Outside the tall windows, the city moved in slow patterns far below. Cars looked small from this height. People even smaller. Bernard noticed how still the office felt compared to the rest of the building. No assistants moving in and out. No phones ringing. Just the two of them. Alexandra finally spoke again. "Do you know how long you've worked here?" Bernard thought about it. "Almost 5 years." She nodded. "I saw that in your file." Her fingers rested lightly on the closed folder. 5 years. And until last week, most of the people on this floor didn't know your name. Bernard gave a small shrug. That's normal. Alexandra studied him carefully. It shouldn't be. Bernard didn't argue. He had long ago accepted how buildings like this worked. People at the top rarely noticed the people who kept the place running quietly underneath. Alexandra continued, when I reviewed the footage, I watched more than just the moment in the lounge. Bernard listened. I watched the hallway cameras from earlier that morning. She tilted her head slightly. You stopped twice to pick up trash someone had dropped, once outside the conference room, once near the elevators. Bernard blinked once. He didn't remember those moments clearly. They were just part of the routine. You also helped one of the interns carry a box when the elevator doors opened. Bernard nodded slowly. Yeah, the box looked heavy. Alexandra leaned back. That's the part of the building most executives never see. Bernard didn't know what to say to that. Alexandra's eyes moved back toward the folder briefly. Do you know who the man was who accused you during a meeting? Bernard thought about the tall man with the sharp voice. No. His name is Daniel Mercer, Chief Operations Officer. Bernard absorbed the name without reaction. Alexandra continued. He was one of the first people to enter the lounge. That sounds right. And he was also one of the first people to assume the worst. Bernard said quietly, people panic. Alexandra's eyes stayed on him. Yes, they do. But something in her tone suggested that wasn't the whole explanation. She opened the folder again and slid one sheet of paper across the desk toward him. Bernard looked down. It was a still frame from the security footage. The hallway outside the lounge. The moment he pushed the door open, the timestamp sat clearly in the corner. Alexandra spoke softly. This image was captured 14 seconds before the assistants entered the room. Bernard studied the picture. He barely recognized himself from that angle, just a man moving quickly through a doorway. Alexandra closed the folder again. The full recording shows everything that happened after. Bernard looked up. And you've seen it? Yes. And Alexandra's answer came without hesitation. You saved my life. The words were calm, not dramatic, but final. Bernard felt something loosen inside his chest. Not relief exactly, more like a weight finally shifting after sitting in the same place too long. Alexandra watched the reaction carefully. Mr. Dean, Walker, do you know why the rest of the footage wasn't released earlier? Bernard gave a faint, tired smile. I can guess. Tell me. Because the video that spread online made the company look like the victim. Alexandra didn't disagree. And the full footage, Bernard continued quietly, shows something messier. What does it show? Bernard met her eyes. It shows people making the wrong assumption. Alexandra nodded slowly. That's exactly what it shows. She stood up from her chair then, moving carefully again but more confidently than before. Bernard watched as she walked toward the window. For a moment she looked out over the city. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone. Not just personal now, decisive. The full recording will be released tomorrow morning. Bernard blinked. To the public? Yes. The certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. Bernard leaned back slightly. That's going to change the story. That's the point. Alexandra turned back toward him. The narrative surrounding this company shifted because of fear. She paused. It will shift again because of truth. Bernard studied her face. He believed she meant it. But he also knew something about the world outside that office. People don't always change their minds, he said. Alexandra nodded. No, but enough of them will. She returned to the desk and picked up another document. This is your formal reinstatement. Bernard looked at the paper. Effective immediately. He hesitated before taking it. Thank you. Alexandra shook her head slightly. This isn't gratitude. Bernard frowned. What is it then? Correction. The word sat firmly between them. Alexandra leaned lightly against the desk. There's another reason I asked you here. Bernard waited. You've seen parts of this company most executives never notice. That's part of the job. Yes. She studied him carefully again. But perspective like that is rare in leadership. Bernard felt the direction of the conversation shifting again. He wasn't sure where it was going this time. Alexandra continued. I've been reviewing internal reports for the past few days. About what? Employee complaints, safety concerns, facility issues. Bernard raised an eyebrow slightly. There are a lot of those. I noticed. Her voice remained calm. But I also noticed something else. Bernard stayed silent. Most of those reports come from people whose voices rarely reach the executive level. Bernard understood that immediately. Janitors, maintenance crews, security staff, the people who saw everything but were rarely asked. Alexandra spoke carefully now. I want to create a position that bridges that gap. Bernard waited. A leadership role focused on worker welfare and operational transparency. Bernard stared at her. And you're telling me this because... Alexandra met his eyes directly. Because I want you to take it. For a moment the office felt completely silent. Bernard looked at her as if trying to make sure he had heard correctly. You want a janitor running part of your leadership structure. Alexandra didn't blink. I want the man who saved my life and understands this building from the ground up. Bernard let out a slow breath. That's a big jump. Yes. And people upstairs aren't going to like it. Alexandra's expression didn't change. They'll adjust. Bernard looked down at the reinstatement paper in his hands, then back up at her. I never asked for any of this. I know. Another pause. But sometimes responsibility finds people anyway. Bernard sat there quietly for a moment. The past week moved through his mind in fragments. The lounge floor. The accusations. The long days at home. Lila reading her homework at the kitchen table. Finally, he asked something simple. When does the footage come out? Tomorrow morning. Bernard nodded slowly. And the job? Alexandra answered without hesitation. It's yours if you want it. Bernard looked out the window at the city below. For the first time since that morning in the executive lounge, the future felt uncertain in a different way. Not heavy, just open. Bernard didn't answer Alexandra right away. The office was quiet again, not tense, just still. Outside the windows, the afternoon light had begun to soften. Long shadows stretched between the buildings across the street. From this height, the traffic below looked almost calm, but Bernard's mind wasn't in the city. It had drifted somewhere smaller, back to a kitchen table. A homework notebook. Lila sitting there with a pencil in her hand. He rubbed the edge of the reinstatement paper between his fingers. You're asking for something big, he said finally. Alexandra nodded. Yes. Bernard leaned forward slightly in the chair. I've spent most of my life working jobs where nobody asks my opinion. That's exactly why I'm asking now. Bernard studied her face carefully, not looking for weakness, looking for certainty. People upstairs will think you're making this decision because of what happened. Alexandra answered without hesitation. I am. Bernard raised an eyebrow slightly. That's honest. It's also accurate. She folded her hands on the desk again. Sometimes a moment reveals a problem that was already there. Bernard nodded slowly. He understood that more than she probably realized. Alexandra continued. For years, this company has talked about values. Bernard listened. Integrity, accountability, fairness. She paused, but when a crisis arrived, those values disappeared faster than they should have. Bernard thought about the conference room, the eyes around the table. The assumption that had come so quickly. Fear makes people protect themselves, he said quietly. Yes, Alexandra replied, but leadership should protect the truth. The room fell quiet again. Bernard leaned back in the chair. You really think someone like me belongs in those meetings? Alexandra gave a faint smile. I think someone like you is exactly what those meetings need. Bernard exhaled slowly. The weight of the past week still sat somewhere inside him. But it didn't feel as sharp now, more like something that had already happened. You said the footage comes up tomorrow. Yes, that's going to change things. Alexandra nodded. It will. Bernard rubbed his hands together lightly. They're going to realize they were wrong. Yes, and some of them won't like that. Alexandra didn't deny it. No. Bernard looked at the skyline again, then back at her. What happens to Mercer? The question hung in the air for a moment. Alexandra answered calmly. He'll be held accountable for the decisions he made. Bernard didn't push further. That wasn't his role. Not yet. Finally, he stood. Alexandra watched him carefully. Have you decided? She asked. Bernard shook his head once. Not yet. She nodded. That's fair. Bernard slipped the reinstatement paper into his jacket pocket. I'll give you an answer tomorrow. Alexandra extended her hand. Bernard shook it. Her grip was firm. Not ceremonial, just human. Thank you again, she said. Bernard gave a small nod. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Marcus was waiting near the elevators. He looked up the moment Bernard stepped out of the office hallway. Well? Bernard smiled faintly. She's doing better. Marcus snorted. I meant the meeting. Bernard leaned against the wall. They're releasing the full footage tomorrow. Marcus blinked. Seriously? Yes. Marcus shook his head slowly. That's going to hit the internet like a truck. Bernard nodded. That's the idea. Marcus studied his face. There's something else. Bernard shrugged slightly. She offered me a job. Marcus raised both eyebrows. What kind of job? Bernard hesitated for a moment. Something new. Marcus laughed once under his breath. You save the CEO's life and suddenly you're getting promoted. Bernard shook his head. It's not like that. Marcus leaned closer. What is it like? Bernard thought about Alexandra's words. Bridging the gap. Giving people a voice. He answered simply, she wants someone upstairs who understands what the building looks like from downstairs. Marcus studied him for a moment, then smiled. Sounds like you. Bernard pushed off the wall. I'll let you know tomorrow. That evening, the apartment felt different. Not larger, just lighter somehow. Lila sat at the table again when Bernard walked in. Same homework. Same careful handwriting. She looked up immediately. How was the meeting? Bernard set his jacket on the chair. It went well. That's good. He sat across from her. They're releasing the full video tomorrow. Her eyes widened slightly. The whole thing? Yes. Lila smiled slowly. Then everyone will know. Bernard nodded. Yes. She leaned back in the chair. That's fair. He watched her for a moment. Kids understood fairness in a way adults sometimes forgot. Then she noticed something else. You're thinking about something. Bernard smiled faintly. How can you tell? You make that face. What face? The one where you're deciding something. Bernard chuckled quietly. She offered me a job today. Lila sat up straight. A different one? Yes. What kind? Bernard leaned back slightly. The kind where I make sure people like me get heard. Lila considered that. Then she said something very simple. You should do it. Bernard raised an eyebrow. That was quick. She shrugged. You always say people should try to fix things when they can. Bernard nodded slowly. I do say that. So, fix it. Her answer carried no hesitation. No doubt. Bernard looked at her across the table. For the first time since the morning in that executive lounge, the decision didn't feel complicated anymore. The video was released the next morning. Bernard didn't watch it right away. He woke before the alarm again, the same way he always did. The apartment was quiet. Early light pushed through the thin gap between the curtains. For a while, he just sat at the edge of the bed, breathing slowly. The world outside had already started reacting. He knew that. The internet moved faster than anyone could keep up with. But for a few minutes, the apartment still belonged only to the two of them. When he stepped into the kitchen, Lila was already there. She had the laptop open. The video was paused on the screen. Bernard recognized the image immediately. The hallway camera. The moment he pushed the executive lounge door open, Lila looked up. It's everywhere. Bernard nodded once. Yeah. She turned the screen slightly so he could see it better. People are watching the whole thing now. Bernard pulled out the chair and sat beside her. The video started again. The hallway footage showed exactly what Marcus had described. Bernard walking down the corridor with the cart. The small pause when he heard the sound. The quick turn toward the door. Then him moving faster than he had realized. Pushing the door open. Disappearing inside. The next camera angle showed the inside of the lounge. Not the floor clearly, but enough to see his body kneel beside Alexandra, his shoulders moving with the rhythm of compressions. 30. Pause. 2 breaths. 30 again. Lila watched silently beside him. The video continued. The moment the assistants burst into the room, the confusion, the shouting, then the first breath returning, the paramedics, everything, uncut, unedited. The video ended with Alexandra being wheeled out on the stretcher, alive. For a few seconds the screen stayed still. Then the comments began appearing below it. Thousands of them, new ones every second. The tone felt different this time. Less accusation, more realization. Bernard closed the laptop gently. That's enough. Leela looked at him. You don't want to see the rest? Bernard shook his head. I saw the part that mattered. She nodded slowly. That was the truth. Bernard leaned back in the chair. Yes. Outside the window the city was already awake. Cars moving, people walking. Somewhere out there, strangers were watching the same video, changing their minds, or refusing to. Either way, the truth had finally stepped into the light, and it didn't need Bernard to defend it anymore. By noon, the calls began. First reporters, then company representatives. Then Marcus. You seen the news yet? Marcus asked. Bernard smiled slightly. Yeah. Marcus laughed on the other end of the phone. Mercer's already taken leave to reflect. Bernard wasn't surprised. People are good at reflecting when the cameras show up. Marcus chuckled. You coming in today? Yes, good. Marcus paused for a moment. You deserve to walk through those doors without people whispering. Bernard thought about that. We'll see. Ashcroft Tower looked the same as always when Bernard arrived. Glass, steel, morning light reflecting off the lobby floor. But something about the atmosphere had changed. People noticed him immediately. Not the same way they had before. No whispers. No phones raised. Just quiet recognition. Marcus stepped out from behind the security desk with a grin. Well, look who's famous. Bernard shook his head. Let's not use that word. Marcus laughed. Fair enough. They stood there for a moment. Then Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. Good to have you back. Bernard nodded. Good to be back. The elevator ride up felt different this time. Not heavy, just quiet. When the doors opened on the executive floor, the assistant greeted him with a small nod. Ms. Ashcroft is expecting you. Bernard walked down the hallway again. The silvery carpet, the same sunlight from the windows. But his steps felt steadier. When he entered the office, Alexandra was already standing. She looked stronger today, more like someone fully returned to her own life. I assume you've seen the footage, she said. Yes, and? Bernard shrugged slightly. It tells the story. Alexandra nodded. It does. She walked around the desk, stopping a few feet in front of him. The company released a statement this morning correcting the record. Bernard wasn't surprised. That's good. She studied him for a moment. Have you made your decision? Bernard didn't hesitate this time. Yes. Alexandra waited. I'll take the job. A small smile appeared on her face. Good, Bernard added quietly, but on one condition. She raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Bernard looked around the office, then back at her. If we're going to fix things, we don't just listen to people when something goes wrong. Alexandra nodded slowly. Agreed. We listen all the time. Her smile widened slightly. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. She extended her hand again. This time the handshake felt different. Not a thank you. Not a correction. A beginning. Later that evening, Bernard returned home. Lila sat on the couch with the laptop again. This time she was smiling. "They're calling you a hero." Bernard hung his jacket on the hook. "I don't need that." She tilted her head. "What do you need?" Bernard thought about the question. Then he answered honestly, "A chance to make sure the next person doesn't go through what we just did." Leela nodded. "That sounds better than being famous." Bernard laughed quietly. "Yes, it did." He sat down beside her on the couch. For a moment they watched the city lights come on outside the window. The same small apartment. The same quiet evening. But something inside Bernard had changed. Not because people now believed him. That part mattered less than he once thought. What mattered was the moment in that lounge. The decision to kneel beside someone who needed help. No audience. No cameras. Just a choice. And now, somehow, that single choice had opened a door he never expected to walk through. Bernard sat there quietly, the weight of the past week settling into something calmer. Not pride, not victory, just a quiet understanding. Sometimes the most important moments in a life begin in silence, and only later reveal how far their echo can travel.